episode 15 of the Primary Maths Podcast, the show where we talk all things primary maths. I'm John Cripwell, and you will notice perhaps that I am here on my own at the moment this week. Becky isn't here for this particular episode, and that's just because we've decided to split this episode into two episodes. We had a little bit of feedback after our summer episodes where people had actually really enjoyed listening to Becky and I talking about the maths of life and the research in 60 seconds-ish and various other little features like that. And so we decided, rather than create a show that was 2 hours long every week, we would experiment a little bit with splitting the show into an interview episode, which is going to be this one, available on a Tuesday, and a shorter summer primary maths podcast style episode with Becky and I talking about the interview, but also giving our maths of life and the other features that have come up as well. And we've had quite a few emails in this week as well about non-standard units of measurement and things that we'll talk about for Friday's episode. So there'll be an episode on Tuesday this week, this one, and an episode on Friday. So you can download that on Friday morning. And if you don't want to hear me and Becky, you can skip that one. If you just want to hear about the interview, which we've got today, you can listen to this one, or you can listen to both. So that's how we're going to try things for a couple of weeks. I would love your feedback on that. Is this a system, a format that is going to work for you? Or would you prefer to have all of those things wrapped into one longer episode? Feedback is a gift, as we are often told. It doesn't have to be written feedback. You can just... No, actually, it does have to be written feedback, because otherwise I don't know how you're going to get it to me. So, yeah, some written feedback would be great, please. Either comments in the YouTube video, if you're watching this on YouTube, or you can email primarymathspodcast@twinkle.co.uk. That's twinkle without the E, of course. Send in your comments. Let us know which version of this podcast you prefer. Or you can get in touch with us on social media. We're on TikTok, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, on X, on Blue Sky, on Threads. Wherever you want to look for us, you can pretty much find us. Without further ado then, we will get into this week's interview, which is a fantastic one, and we will follow that up on Friday with a little bit of a debrief between Becky and I. But for now, enjoy this week's interview episode of the Primary Maths Podcast. My guest today is about to embark on his 20th year in primary education, and for most of that time he's been thinking very hard about maths. He spent the majority of his teaching career at a primary school in Hucknall, Nottinghamshire, and has then supported schools across the Flying High Partnership since it began in 2012. He now serves as the Trust's lead practitioner for maths, working across more than 30 schools, as well as holding a long-standing role as Assistant Maths Hub Lead with the East Midlands West Maths Hub. His deep knowledge of curriculum, pedagogy and subject leadership is matched only by his ability to ask the questions the rest of us hadn't quite thought of yet. Today we'll explore what it means to lead maths across a large trust, how to prepare schools for Ofsted without losing the soul of what makes great teaching, and why early maths might be one of the most important ideas in the system right now. My guest today is Tom Isherwood, and I'm delighted to have you on the show. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks, John. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on.
So most of the guests that I've spoken to up to this point, Tom, I had never met before, but you and I have crossed paths once or twice at a half term for about the last 6 or 7 years, I think. So just give people that little bit of context. What we normally like to do, as I mentioned, is start with what maths was like for you as a pupil at school. So if you don't mind just going back in time a little bit, did you enjoy maths at school? Was it a good subject for you?
Absolutely.
And what was teaching like?
I always enjoyed maths at school. My dad is a maths teacher, a secondary school maths teacher. So it was something that I think I always had a natural affinity for, something that I enjoyed, and something I probably found quite easy throughout school. And that also was quite tricky when I took up teaching, because why does stuff happen in maths? Well, it just does. It naturally does. And it took me a while to figure out that I needed to go back through the Christmas lights and find the one that was broken and see all the steps that I'd put there to be able to explain something. And a lot of that stuff had happened subconsciously for me. So it was a bit of a challenge at the beginning of my career, but learning to be more reflective about that, I think, has had a big impact on the way that I teach.
Oh, I didn't know that your dad was a maths teacher. That all makes sense now.
Yes,
Did you,
down the road from where I am at the moment, he taught in the same school for his entire career. And there
Wow.
was a moment when he decided to retire. There were two ECTs in the staff room moaning about a child. And he looked at them and he said, well, it doesn't surprise me. His grandfather was exactly the same. At that point, he knew he'd done enough. It was time to move on.
It was time. Yeah. 3 generations is plenty. Did you ever think about going and being a maths specialist secondary teacher?
I did briefly. Think the thing that swayed me was I felt it might become quite repetitive quite quickly, and I wanted every day to be different. And then within about 30 minutes of being a primary teacher, I thought maybe not quite so different every day. I think that I just find primary maths fascinating. I don't know if I'd immerse myself so much in secondary maths, I probably would find it as interesting as I do primary maths, but I think it's the accessibility of it that I find so interesting, that pretty much anyone can get there fairly quickly with the right set of resources and support and beliefs.
It's all that thinking, isn't it, about how you help the children to get to that, as you say, relatively accessible point. But even those relatively accessible points might have numerous steps, prior steps in order to get to them, to be able to access them. And it's unpicking those, I think, that I enjoyed particularly when I was teaching. So you're not teaching full-time now. Do you still do any teaching?
I do a little bit. I am employed, shall we say, owned by the Flying High Trust for 5 days a week. Loan me out to the maths hub for 2 of those days where I do my maths hub work. And then my remaining 3 days are split between a deployment and then my general lead practitioner role for the Flying High Trust. So that deployment will be a half-term deployment for a day a week in a school within our trust. And how that generally works is the morning I spend doing teaching and learning across school for maths, and then in the afternoon I'll do leadership with the maths leader. So typically I will collaboratively plan with each year group for a couple of hours, and then the following week either we team teach or I teach that one lesson that we taught. And I think that collaborative planning is the most impactful, most powerful thing that you can do as a teacher. And it's an interesting role doing that, going into a school and meeting children for the first time and teaching them then and there without those relationships, without that previous knowledge of what they know. But I very much enjoy it. It's a bit hit and miss. I think the highs are higher, the lows are lower. Sometimes they're just, we've completely mispitched this. I don't quite get the kids. But oftentimes it's a lot of fun.
That sounds like a really interesting model for trying to target support, I guess. The maths subs do a similar sort of idea, don't they, in terms of targeted support to a particular school for a number of days, but you get to have much more of a intensive support
and I think
for particular schools.
It's the capture of those conversations. So we've done a lot of work on lesson design that we might touch upon later, but having captured on a piece of paper the general route that we went through, the number of times I will sit and plan with the teacher and they'll walk away with this piece of paper clutching it like they've got something really important that they can go back to, because sometimes I feel like the guy out of Jack and the Beanstalk who sells the magic beans for the cow, and Jack gets home and goes, oh, it made sense when we talked about it, but what was it we did? Why did I swap this cow for these magic beans? But actually that it's making the transient permanent. We go back to, this is what we started thinking about. Then we did this. Then we thought about that. Just giving people a route to go through, I find very impactful.
Is that what you think the secret to the success of collaborative planning as an approach for professional development is then? Because I agree in everything that I've done working with maths leads and teachers in schools. I think every time that we start with planning a lesson and trying to figure out how we're going to get from point A to point B, and how we're going to support pupils along the way or challenge them, that's always been really effective, I think, as a means of professional development. What do you think why do you think that is?
I think there was something you mentioned earlier about, in that conversation, about going back, unpicking the pieces, thinking what children might need to know for this, what they might do for that. And I think experienced teachers and teachers who have maybe a natural predilection towards the teaching of maths subconsciously do that anyway. I think good maths teachers are good maths teachers because they make good choices. They make good choices when planning the lesson, and they make good choices within the lesson. I think because of the time pressures involved with teaching, you don't often get the opportunity to really sit down and think in depth about a lesson. And I always preface any collaborative planning session I do with teachers by saying, we are about to spend a gratuitous amount of time planning one lesson. It will take us 2 hours. I don't expect you to ever spend 2 hours planning a lesson again. But what we're doing is developing our understanding of how you plan a lesson as much as planning the lesson itself. And so I think teaching teachers how to make choices is important. So we're going to do this, but we're going to do this for this reason. What else could we do? What do we expect the children to notice here? What do we want them to notice? So how we present it so they do notice that.
It's almost a metacognitive approach to planning a lesson. So we talk, don't we, about, thinking while we're, that's what we want the children to do. But actually, in terms of PD, this is what you want the teachers to do as well.
There was something I distinctly remember. It was wandering down to the shops at lunchtime. In your teaching career, when you're having a bad day and you're just like, I just need to get out for a walk at lunchtime. I was wandering down from the school that I worked at, and I had this thought that no one has ever taught me how to plan a lesson. And I was on my third school by that point. So I'd been teaching at least 4 or 5 years. I thought, no one's ever taught me how to plan a lesson. And I just think there's a gap in the market there. There's something that we could be doing that is potentially helpful for teachers. And not everyone does the same thing. And that's another thing about kind of working across a trust or a range of schools through the Maths Hub. It's important not to go, this is how I plan a lesson, so you do it like this. And this piece of work that I got to, I'd done over about 18 months. And every time I'd done any collaborative planning without any guidance, I encouraged people to talk about, what's that, without sounding too pretentious, what's their process? What do you do when you sit down and plan a lesson? What do you think about first, and then what, and then what? And it was only through doing that I realised that there were certain commonalities that people who were confident in planning maths lessons, who kind of were perceived as being strong maths teachers, thought about in a certain way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think it's something I've changed my mind about, possibly, or come to a realisation on, probably with your support, to be honest, Tom, is I was quite the advocate of, I don't know, when I started teaching, it was a 3-part lesson. You'd have your starter, your main teacher, your plenary. That evolved over time to about a 12-part lesson. I think by the time I had my last lesson, maybe not quite 12 parts, but there was certainly a lot of elements to fit into a lesson. And all of them, I think, individually absolutely valid, but not necessarily all of them required in every lesson at the same time in the same place. And so that rigid lesson structure format, I think can be a constraint. And this was one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, actually, which is convenient. So we'll get on to what good lesson design is maybe in a moment. But there was a report, I don't know if you saw it, or I may have mentioned it previously, from the NEU, which coincided with their summer conference, or spring conference this year, 2025, that was entitled, Are You on Slide 8 Yet? And they'd done a survey of a few thousand teachers, and I think it was 38% said that they felt constrained by schemes of work and by lesson structures, and felt that they had lost their autonomy as teachers. Now, you work with a trust of over 30 schools, and I know that you have input to a degree. I'm not saying that you dictate, but there's a collaborative approach to what does a flying high maths lesson perhaps look like, what's included. How do you balance having some consistency in approach with allowing teachers the space to be able to teach the children that are in front of them in the way that they know is best for those children, do you think?
Good question. I think that I would go back to what one of my favourite quotes about maths, which was many years ago when we used to do the Shanghai exchange, and we had some teachers come over from Shanghai and teach in our classrooms, and they'd have 100 primary school teachers sat in the back of a classroom while they taught 30 strangers who were about 8 years old and didn't speak the same language as them. And they were brilliant. And I can remember this one teacher from Shanghai, Sonny, was teaching a lesson. He was teaching a year 2 class, and afterwards we were having a question and answer session. And he was asked, what's the biggest difference between teachers in Shanghai and teachers in England? And he thought for a moment and he said, in England, you plan for what the children are going to do. In Shanghai, we plan for how the children are going to think. And I think that's always stuck with me in terms of my own practice from teaching, but also in terms of working with teachers. So where professional development, there are some things where you just have to do things in a certain way. We don't want people kind of putting their own unique spin on safeguarding. Follow the rules, do it properly. Whereas with maths, there are some ideals that we're working towards. So what I try and do is ask questions in that planning guidance rather than telling people what they need to do at that point. So the purpose of this part of the lesson is to make sure that any prior knowledge children are going to need in a minute is brought to the forefront of their memory, rather than you need to put 6 questions there that do this, this, and this. So it's making sure the rationale behind each part of the lesson is clear, rather than dictating what they need to do within that. And it's not parts of the lesson that you have to do them all in this order, but if there is some knowledge that the children are going to find useful that you know they already know, we might as well reactivate that. At some point, you're going to have to teach the children the new learning. And we spent a long time talking about what that part of the lesson was going to be called, whether it was going to be called the teach. Originally, I almost got to the point where we could call it discovery, but not quite there. But I think the teach facilitator model is nice because it gets to the point that actually we do need to model this. We know what the best representation is. We know how we're going to show this thing. But actually what we're doing is facilitating. We're going from the children's prior knowledge to get them to where they need to be. And that might take many different forms. And it's not you need to start with I do and show the children how to do it. We've got a nice phrase that we use, that giving the children the chance to discover without leaving the discovery to chance. So there's ideas behind things. There's clarity about why we would do those things, but there's not an insistence on you must do this thing on this way. And I think the difference between having a set of rules and these ideas is it only works if you sit and plan with someone, because that's where the nuance gets captured. We've deliberately tried to keep it down to a side of A4, our guidance. It could be a book. However, the nuance gets transferred through sitting, talking, watching lessons, and kind of building a shared understanding of what these questions mean.
I think that's absolutely spot on. In my last leadership role, I think I'd not quite got it to a side of A4. It was more like a small booklet. But you're right. The key was whenever we had a new teacher joining, whether it was an ECT or a long-term supply or an experienced teacher, I as maths lead and assistant head would have time to sit down with them and say, this is what maths looks like at this school. This is our approach to it. This is why, because I think that's really important for teachers to understand why we're doing it this way. It's not just because it's written on this piece of paper. There is, purpose behind it and reasoned, research-backed evidence to say that this is a good way to teach. And I think that can help.
Often gets missed is the importance of that piece of paper on which it's written, because you email it to someone, they're never going to read it with the best will in the world. You talk to that ECT or that new member of staff and they'll get it, and they're probably not going to read it, but they will have 5 other people talking to them in the same way at some point during those 2 or 3 days when they're just starting with the school. So having it for them to go back to go, oh, what was it? Yeah, that's there. That's what provides you with the consistency within the school.
Yeah, that's really good. And you're right, having it written down is important because it is codified there. I used to call it our sort of maths Bible, really, that if you want to know, if you're going to plan a lesson for the first time, have this piece of paper near you, so just to remind you of the things that we've talked about. So, okay, we've got on to lesson design then. So I was going to ask you what your take is on the I do, we do, you do approach. Which, yeah, you can mention you did bring it up a moment ago.
Yeah, I'm not a massive fan of it. I don't know whether it's ever been presented as a thing in maths. I think it's something that comes
I've
from
heard it.
phonics.
I've heard it
Oh,
recently as something that, having conversations with teachers. This is where we do the I do, we do, you do part, and I think people see it as I'm going to model something, then we'll do a works example together, and now you can have a go at it independently.
and I think there may be times in the lesson where that is a valid teaching tool, but as a structure of the lesson, it terrifies me. So something I saw the other day that I really liked is just flipping it round. And if you're going to start your lesson, let's do, you do, here's a problem. Here's a problem that's well pitched that you can get into, but you're not going to rush straight to the answer of it. And even if you get to the answer quickly, there's a bit more thinking to do around it. So you just take a little bit of time to have a think about it. Then we'll do it all together. We will share those ideas, and it's not right, put your hands up, you, and you talk to me. Because as a teacher, I've already anticipated what you're going to do with this problem. And rather than rushing to work with a group of kids, I'm going to stand back and I'm going to watch. I'm a strong believer that I do my best work when it looks like I'm doing nothing. So I'm just going to stand and watch and listen to those children, and then kind of select the ones that are saying what I want them to say. And we can kind of build that understanding together. So they've had a go, then when we've done it. And then finally, I'll say, well, what we're saying is flip over my flip chart, blueprint to presenter style. I've already got most of it here, but we'll fill it in together. So you have got that really clear modelling, and children do need that really clear kind of representation of the structure of maths, of what's going on. I think that's one of the things that Mastery does best, but actually it started with the children at their own level of understanding, because otherwise if you're just telling children what to do, it just becomes a list of facts and procedures to memorize.
Yeah, it sounds like for the last 10 years of my teaching career, I was teaching backwards, because I was very much doing that. We'll start with the problem that you do, and then we'll have a look at it together, and then I will pull it all together for you and show you, kind of the way that I.
That's much more difficult to do well than it sounds. You need to have real confidence.
I think my class would agree with you, Tom. Yeah.
But knowing what might happen, it's all right if things happen that you don't expect. But I think that teachers always feel the need for children to be getting everything right all the time. Actually, if I present a nice problem and 2 or 3 children go, oh, got this, and then we can have that discussion and build that understanding together, that's so much more powerful than me just telling them what to do. And it's amazing what children come out with when they're given the opportunity to think about things and reason about things.
Yeah, fantastic. So let's just think about lesson design then, because I know it's an area that you are passionate about, and you've touched on it already quite a lot, which is great. If you were going to sit down with me as a teacher that you were working with, what would you be hoping that I would take out of a conversation about lesson design and collaborative planning? What elements make a good lesson, do you think? I know they may not be in a strict order, but what are we looking for? Again, not tick boxes as I'm going in as a maths lead, I want to see all of these things in every lesson, but what should teachers be thinking about when they're planning a lesson?
I think the first thing that they should think about when they're planning a lesson, and it seems startlingly obvious, however, it's not, is what are the children learning today? And I think that really does get missed a lot of the time. Back in the day when you and I started teaching and chicken tasted like chicken and dinosaurs roamed the earth, if you hadn't thought about your lesson and you hadn't planned your lesson, there was a really awkward 45 minutes to an hour where you just stood in front of a bunch of kids with some silence going on. However, now there are things already there. So if you've not thought about it... We
called that reading for pleasure.
Brilliant. But now you can almost teach a lesson without having pre-thought about it. And if you're going through the slides, you've not got that absolute clarity on what do you want all children to be able to do by the end of today's lesson. Because unless you know that, you can't keep focusing back in it. So first of all, what are all the children going to be able to do by the end of the lesson? And almost select a question.
And you're right, sorry, interjecting. But the number of times that I've worked with a teacher who's come to see me to say this lesson did not go well, at the end of it, It was a year 4 lesson on division, and at the end of the lesson, the children just couldn't do division. And actually, when you looked at what they were trying to do in that lesson, what the purpose of the lesson was, it wasn't to get all the children at the end of the lesson to be able to do division. It was to start to lay the foundations that they're understanding how numbers can be manipulated, and repeated subtraction as part of addition, of division, or partitioning numbers to make things easier, or reframing numbers. So having that clarity over what your end goal looks like is really important.
And what you will find is, if you ask teachers, what is it the children are learning today, and then be quiet, they will talk for half an hour, 45 minutes of everything that those children need to know. And I find just drilling down into a single question, with the caveat, we're not just going to teach them to do this question, we're going to provide them rich learning opportunities and to do lots of different things within the lesson. But unless they can answer this question, they're not ready for the next stage of the journey. So my goal is for everyone to be able to do this by the end of the lesson. So I think that clarity is an important place to start. Then I would think about what it looks like. So personally, I'm a big advocate of using a flip chart in the lesson, because with slides, things go. It goes and goes and goes. Where's that bit to go back to? And kind of good learning is about making the transient permanent. So I want to think, what is the best representation to expose the structure of the maths today, and what's going to be most useful for the children later on in the lesson when they're doing some guided practice or when they're doing their independent practice. So we kind of design what might go on the flip chart to help them. And then the final part, that start of the lesson, is thinking about, like, if I want the children to tell me to draw that, what do I have to ask them? What do I have to get them to do? What are the questions? What do they need to see? What do they need to have in front of them? So when we get to that flip chart, some kids smugly look at their whiteboard and go, hey, check me out, just what I did. Some children will go, yep, that's what I did, but that's perhaps a more elegant or efficient way of getting to the answer. And then there will be some children who struggled, who needed it explaining, but having grappled with the problem gives the explanation much more relevance than just being given a bunch of stuff to remember.
And would you always have the models already drawn on the flip chart? And I'm not just asking this as somebody who staggered into class at 8:30 in the morning and didn't have time to prepare it in advance, but I always found that there was something around constructing it, if possible, with the children as a model, explaining your thinking as you're going, because I would be hoping that they would be able to do this. And this is one of my issues with PowerPoints, is that often something appears on the PowerPoint, we don't know how it got there. If we're not really careful, we're not entirely sure what it's actually representing, and then I press a button and something magical happens and it turns into something else. And that's not to say that you can't teach well from a PowerPoint, but I did think that there was something about co-constructing models with children that had benefits.
So two things there. One is about the use of PowerPoints where things swish in and swish out. I love an animation, but it's got to be an animation for the right reason. The one that gets me the most is base 10, a 10 stick changing into 10 ones. Looks really, really easy when it's on a PowerPoint. Actually, it's really, really tricky to do real life. So I think the best investment you can make as a maths teacher is the visualizer, and kind of lining up, letting them see that exchange take place. In terms of what you say about flip charts, do I do those in advance? There is no chance me getting through this phrase in one go, but I would have them pre-planned but partially prepared. So I know exactly what's going to go on there, but they don't want to stare at my back for 30 seconds while I draw 100 grids. So anything that's on there that will help me ensure that it is well presented, so it's easy to see, so it's clear, so it's neat, so it's got those high standards of presentation we would expect from the kids, I would do in advance. But the actual completing of it, the filling out of it, I would do in the moment, as you say, co-construct.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I plan them. I'm very lucky. When I teach a maths lesson, I usually spend a lot of time planning it because I co-plan it with other people. But I would do things like think about which colours we will use for which numbers to draw attention to what, and I will have a little blue dot in that corner and a little red dot in that corner, because in the heat of battle with the children, these things often go out in the window. So the more guided, the better. I can remember, in fact, one of the first Shanghai exchanges we had. Again, teacher had done this lesson in a school hall, lots of teachers at the back, and they'd had 2 flip charts in the lesson. that they'd filled in as they'd gone through. And I was tidying up after the session, and I found two A4 pieces of paper that had exactly what was on the flip chart. And that was my first time that I went, it's important to think about exactly what's going where on there.
They're not just making it up on the fly.
No, indeed.
Yeah.
So
Can I just, you touched on something there that I don't want to just gloss over, because I think it's really important. And not just because school budgets are so tight that different coloured pens are a luxury. But you mentioned different coloured pens for different things. Why not just do everything in black pen so that all the children can see it? What's the purpose of the different colours?
If I've got a pictorial representation where perhaps part of it is coloured in red and that bit represents a certain number, then I will have that number written in red. So it's that dual coding to make the connection between things. I want to, and this is something you don't hear very often, I want to make the learning as easy as possible. There is quite rightly a culture of high challenge and high expectation in primary schools, but that's not mutually exclusive with making learning new concepts as easy as possible. And part of that is through having really clear representations, thinking about what the children are going to see, thinking about what you're going to draw attention to. So colour coding your diagram is going to make that learning easier. And yeah, I think we need to start a movement about make maths easy again.
It's one of those things that can very easily be sort of glossed over or lost, isn't it? I remember when I first started looking into teaching for mastery, I was lucky enough to work with somebody we both know called Alison, who came to visit my school, and we did a learning walk, and we were looking at the representations on the board. And one of the things that she said that stuck with me ever since was just making sure that the children know what every part of that representation really, what is it representing? Where has that number come from? You've just said a number. What does that number mean? If we're working with a word problem, what is that number in the word problem? Is it ice creams? Is it watermelons? Whatever. Where have you just pulled that number from? And just being really explicit with, I'm not just going to say a number here without explaining where I've pulled this number from, because those children, I think, who sometimes find maths difficult, struggle to make those connections.
Absolutely.
Themselves.
Often I'll look at a working wall or displays in the classroom and we'll see loads of calculations on there, and I'll look at a poor child in the corner of the classroom who looks like they're struggling, and it's like going into early years and seeing Ulysses written on the wall in fine script, which means nothing to you, does it? There's no connection to what's going on. So I think, yeah, making sure that it's expressing the most amount of meaning in the fewest words is what I would always say. So having decided what's on your flip chart and how you're going to get the children there, I think the next thing that we think about is the independent practice. And we're jumping about a bit here. We're kind of starting 10 minutes into the lesson, maybe 5 minutes into the lesson, then we're going towards the end of the lesson. But I think it's having a good idea of where you want the children to get to. It's not being led by task completion, but it's identifying this is what I want the children to be able to do. If they're confident in this thing, then these are the kind of activities they'll be comfortable with. Checking that the first few questions are as accessible as possible. And accessible might mean different things on different days, but often it's the way it's set out. I think on a really good day, that first question will look exactly as the same as what's on your working wall, because you planned what's going on here. Is there adequate chance for children to practice that new learning? Because often it's one and then done and on to the rest of it, where actually we need to build a bit of muscle memory around this thing. And then is there a good level of challenge? Are children being asked to do things in different ways? But also thinking about how you want them to respond to that. Because I find a lot with textbooks, especially in Key Stage 1, it's hard to articulate that in words, let alone write it down. So is that the best way to ask that question, or is that the best way to ask the children to respond to that question? So once I know where I want the children to be by the end of the lesson, I've selected that work, or if I'm using a textbook, I've looked at what that given work is, I'll then think about the route from where we finished at the flip chart to where they need to be by the end of the lesson, and think what experiences do children need. And I think that usually the way that's presented is the same way every time. I ask you a question, you have a go, we have a bit of a chat, and we go from where you are to the model answer. I think the only difference between that and the beginning part of the lesson is introducing the new learning. And then the rest of the lesson is kind of deepening it, securing it, depending on what's going on. It might be sometimes that it's 2 or 3 activities that build across the lesson. But it's, what experiences the children need to be ready for the independent part of the learning. And then the reflection at the end, the last bit of the lesson, is just checking that they can do the key part of the lesson. So it might be that question that we started by thinking about, that's the key question. Let's check that they can all do that. It might be something a little bit thinkier, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. And then finally, having done all that, the final bit we plan is the very start of the lesson. Because until you know exactly what's going to happen all the way through, you're not sure what the key bit of learning needs to be in their heads. So I'll give you an example of that. I can remember we were planning a lesson, and it's that lesson that looks at the 3, 6, and 9 times table and the kind of pattern between the three after you've learnt them. And we couldn't figure out what to do as a reactivate. We planned the whole lesson, and then we thought, actually, what this is, it's the 5 and 10 times table. If we counted 5s to get one half of the room to say one number and the other half of the room to say the other number, what do we notice? We notice that they're saying the 10 times table. Why? Well, why is that? Because 2 5s make 10, so every other one isn't. And then we could apply that learning into the 3 6s and 9s, and then those patterns that we spotted would start to make a bit more sense to the children. But that didn't reveal itself until we'd planned the whole lesson.
Oh, that's interesting. And I think you're right. I spent too much of my career starting at the start, whereas actually, it may have been more prudent to consider the end and work backwards, almost backwards from there. Brilliant. Okay, so just changing gear slightly then, putting a little bit more of a leadership hat on. You are very lucky as part of your role within the trust that whenever there is an Ofsted inspection at one of the schools, you may be parachute. Do they give you a parachute? Is it a flying high parachute that you have when you arrive at the school?
Not quite a parachute. I'll usually get a phone call though. And I feel sorry for the person that phones us all. We're not always best pleased to hear from them.
Well, you've just come off the back of a particularly intensive time of Ofsted support, haven't you?
Yeah,
I don't know if you can go into that.
In the last year, we've had about 20 Ofsted inspections across our trust. In the last 17 weeks, we've had 10 Ofsted inspections. But now we're not due anymore until next year. And I can't remember ever being in this position. So I'm slightly DMOB happy at the moment, but also slightly sad. Like this thing that I've spent a lot of time doing and working on, I'm not going to get to do anymore, and I've come to enjoy it.
I think there are HMIs that have definitely done fewer Ofsted inspections in recent weeks than yourself, Tom.
Absolutely. What I don't want to do is kind of overplay my importance in this. It's not like I go in and tell the schools what to do. They are very much their own schools. I'm just there as a reassuring voice almost, just going through to help people just feel a bit more confident, collect their thoughts, know what it is that they do, but how they're going to say that and how they're going to present that the following day.
Yeah, and I had my last ever probably Ofsted was about almost 12 months ago to the day actually, and the trust that I worked in very similarly, very sensibly brought in people to support us as we prepared, the day before and during the day as well, just to have somebody else just to check things with who may know a little bit more, who's had more experience of Ofsted can be really useful. Now, obviously, the framework, when we're recording this, it's June 2025. The framework for Ofsted is likely to change. But still, what would be your kind of key pieces of advice, I suppose, if you were going into an inspection with somebody in one of your schools? What are you going in and saying?
So a few things, really. I think top line stuff is knowing what you stand for as a school. So kind of having some clarity about what you're trying to achieve and why. And very quickly you can see the difference between those maths leads with the drive and passion and kind of maths is important to me, this school's important to me, and I want to make a change here and this is what I'm trying to do. And those that are just going through the motions. It's like if you ask someone about why you teach, the kids are really important to me. Are they? That's quite a unique standpoint for someone who's become a primary school teacher. And it's not that the kids aren't important, they'll be at the heart of what you do, but quite often you'll find that there's something very specific that links the ethos of that school, but kind of is prevalent within the maths. So I was at a school today and I was talking to the head teacher before I worked with a maths lead, and the maths lead, very new to the role. They're starting in September, but they come to our last PLC, our last professional learning community. And the conversation with the head teacher is, I want you to work with this new maths lead and help them think about what they want to drive within school over the next year. I said, great, I'm happy to do that. What's going on as a whole school though? And the head was very much about, they were implementing a character curriculum, because at their school, it's very much about not just the knowledge acquired, but it's the child that acquires it. So there was something around that in the maths in the school that, right, how does that fit to maths? And what was really nice is when I spoke to the new maths lead, I said, what does maths look like? And they talked about kind of that idea as children as mathematical learners. And the work that they'd done on lesson design within the school meant that children were seeing themselves more as learners rather than kind of receptacles of knowledge. So the first thing is, if you've got clarity about what you stand for and it's something that you can passionately talk about, that makes a huge difference to get you off a good start. Then the next thing is, how do you do it? How do you get to the point where the teacher is stood in front of the class ready to go? So are there clear, consistent planning processes in place? And I'm not talking about reams and reams of written planning, but guidance on, you used the phrase earlier, being a critical consumer of a scheme. What is it that I should be thinking about? What point do I start this journey as a teacher? Do I need to go back to, if I'm in year 4, and read through the curriculum from year 1? Probably not practical. But then how do I know in year 4 what the children should have already learned? So we've done things as a trust that make that a bit clearer for teachers. But I'm always thinking about the ECT. What is it? If I'm an ECT, how do I know what to do? And clarity is kindness. Okay, so as a leader, you have to identify what the most effective things to spend your time on. What do you want your teachers to do? What activity yields the most return on investment? And that's the thing that you are insistent that teachers do, because you know that's what's going to have an impact with the kids. So you've got what do you stand for and how do you do it? And then it's how do you know? So my boss has got a phrase that's say it, show it, seal it. So you need to be able to talk a good game. You may have picked up that I can do that when it comes to maths. What I've learned to get better at is being able to show it in things that are written down and exemplify it. And I said earlier that the piece of paper is important, and Tom of 10 years ago wouldn't have told you that a piece of paper is important. It's fine, we'll figure it out. Actually, that consistency, so everyone knows we've codified, this is what the thing is, this is what it looks like, this is what you're expected to do. But the final bit is the seal it. And people often get a bit confused by what we mean by seal it. And it's being able to see it every day in practice. And I go back to one of the Ofsted inspections. The last one I did as actually a maths lead. So I'd been doing my day a week deployment, but I'd been in school for about a year or so, and it was a junior school and an infant school, 2 separate schools, 1 head teacher, same site. Not quite sure how that works. However, we've done a lot of work with the teachers around.
Probably to do with budgets, but
quite possibly, yes. But we've done a lot of work with the teachers around lesson design, things like that, and getting the children talking in lessons. And we'd had the interview, and that had gone really well. I talked a good game. Yeah, this is what we do. I'd shown in the books, I'd shown in the policies, that all measured up quite nicely. And then I took a deep breath as we went for a walk around the classrooms. And I wasn't trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes, kind of, we'd been on a journey. And actually, I was really proud of where we got to. But even so, you go, before you go into those classrooms, and I went into the first year 1 classroom, and I was like, yep, this one's okay. And then I went into the second year 1 classroom, and I was like, we're getting away with this. We're going to get away with this. And I can remember thinking we're getting away with it. And then by the time we got into the 4th classroom, I went, we're not getting away with anything. Kind of, it's just what we've spent a lot of time getting good at. This is what it looks like. Yeah. So I think, as I say, I'm looking forward to a change in Ofsted, because don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we're perfect. I'm not saying that everything we do is the right thing. I'm saying that I think what we do for the right reasons. And I think we're doing it fairly well. And I think there are structures in place that are fairly effective. We can tweak them, we can build on them, and we'll continue to do that. But I'm quite interested to see when it's another lens shone on it, are we still deemed as effective? And I'm fairly confident that we will be. The final thing that I would say as a maths lead, so you've got to know what you stand for, you've got to know how you do it, and you've got to be able to make sure that you know that you are doing it. But Steve Radcliffe, he's a leadership person, he does something called FED, Future Engaged Deliver. He talks about leaders should be up to something. And I think as a maths lead, you should always be up to something. There should be something that you're working on, something that you're trying to get better at, something that you're trying to change. And what was really nice, the school that I was talking about this morning, where the head teacher had said character curriculum, building the children as learners rather than just receptacles of knowledge. He said the PLC, the thing that really struck him is we were talking about a productive disposition to learning maths. So what is it that makes a good mathematician? How do you get children curious and resilient and collaborative? And I thought, yeah, that's the thing. And I could see in this maths leader's eyes, him coming in the room a little bit daunted and then leaving going, that's it. That's what I'm going to be up to next year. And our job now is to think about, right, how do you get up to that in a good way, in an impactful way.
That's really, really helpful, Tom. Thank you. And as I say, as somebody who's been through quite a few of these alongside schools in the last 12 months or so, I know you're talking from experience. And I think what you touched on there as well was a little bit more about that, what makes an individual school that school, what is the character of that school, and how do we see that in the maths? That ties back, I think, to that idea of teacher autonomy. You've got your individual autonomy within your class, within the framework, and also the school within the trust framework. How is that school showing its identity as part of a trust? I think that's really important. We're fairly close to wrapping up now, but I did want to ask what your current sort of foci. What are you currently focusing on at the moment? I know you touched on in talking about Ofsted there, that sort of critical consumerism of schemes of work. But I think you also mentioned early maths to me before we started recording.
Yes. So there's a few things, 3-4 things that are on my department plan, which is the fancy name for what I'm up to at the moment. One of which is next year, I think I'm having early maths and early years maths on, because the concentric circles, if you looked at it in a Venn diagram, that there's slightly more to early maths than just early years maths. But someone who's spent...
A bit like early reading, I suppose, from an English point of view.
Absolutely the same as that. So I think as someone who spent the vast majority of my career teaching in Key Stage 2, done a bit of teaching in Key Stage 1. I'm not sure I've ever actually taught a lesson in early years, but I've spent a lot of time over the last year or so developing my understanding of what good practice is and being able to articulate that. And it's been very exciting for me because it challenges preconceptions. It challenges that kind of, when you're working over a lot of schools, it's that balance between loose and tight, kind of, this is the structure in which we're working. However, there's going to be some freedom within that. That's especially true with very small children. It's that balance between maths is a complicated thing, that actually the chances of 30 children turning up this morning going, "Oh, sir, can we learn about doubles today?" That's quite slim. So we're probably going to have to put a curriculum in place where we make sure we cover everything in a coherent, sensible manner. However, at the other end of that continuum is that children do learn best through play and having those opportunities to explore for themselves. So learning how we balance those two ideals and what really good practice looks like. So that's one thing that we've been working on quite a lot, and that's still early on in my understanding, but I think we're starting to get somewhere with that. The age-old mixed age problem, if we had an answer, I'd be a rich man. But I feel we're getting closer. We're getting closer through. And then the final thing is, I don't know quite how to badge it, but it is quite possibly the disciplinary knowledge of being a mathematician. So substantive knowledge is knowing facts. I know what total means. I know what the mean means. I know this and that. We're clear on how we teach that and when we teach that. The procedural knowledge, we're very clear on how we teach that. The disciplinary knowledge for what it means to be a good mathematician is slightly vaguer. A nice activity to do is look at the Year 6 SATs paper, look at a question and go, right, what's facts? What's procedures? What's everything else? And when do we teach that everything else? And I think that's what we're talking about when we're talking about problem solving, and certainly to a certain extent talking about reasoning, kind of turning children into mathematical thinkers. And it's not necessarily something that you can put in the skills ladder. They're not certain kinds of problems that, well, possibly are some groups of problems you might learn to solve, but it's a lot more about mathematical learning behaviours. And you know it when you see it. I saw a lesson, I keep banging on about this lesson, it was a couple of weeks before SATs, Year 6 teacher, and it was, I would say probably the best lesson, definitely in the top 2 lessons I've ever seen. It was phenomenal. What made it phenomenal was the children. And it wasn't that the houses around this school had magically produced children who could talk about maths and who were curious and who could work together to solve problems. But I saw so much of it in that lesson. It was just beautiful. And it was partly the attitudes of the children, that they would be sitting doing a question on their own, and then they kind of look at each other and go, yeah, I've got a bit stuck on that one. I'm thinking this. And they're like, yeah. And they get to an answer together. And I'd just not seen that happen on such a large scale before. But it was also the teacher had seeded this thought. he'd asked a question 3 slides ago that made them think in that way. And it was just brilliant to see. So how we can capture that lightning in a bottle and get it more widely spread across the trust and more widely is something that I'm very interested in going forward.
Could be a book in that, Tom.
Well,
I
maybe.
think if you find out, I would love to know. Thank you so much. I've, as ever, thoroughly enjoyed talking to you this afternoon. We will finish with 3 quick-fire questions, if you don't mind. So the first one is, and I don't know the answer to this, do you have a favourite number? And
27.
if you do, I'm sure 27.
27.
Great stuff. Right, let's move on. No, why is 27 your favourite number? You were very definitive.
Yeah, 3 is the magic number, and it's the most 3 number there is, because it's 3 times 3 times 3, and it's 3 lots than 10 times 3. So there's something very 3 about the number 27, but it has some decency not to be 3 at the same time. And I just think it's a lot of fun.
Your favourite resource for teachers could be a book, could be a blog, could be your own private memoirs. Whatever you think teachers, what's something that teachers should engage with?
I think a visualizer. I think seeing the sleight of hand, seeing things happen in time, and there's something about it being there and being done rather than being on a screen, kind of seeing how those manipulatives get manipulated and everyone being able to see it. And even writing answers in books, seeing how that happens for setting things out, getting kids work. It's like being on telly. You get a kid's whiteboard and you put it under the screen and it's there. It's like seeing yourself at the cinema or something like that. There's something slightly magical about it. So I
totally agree. And I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier about the flip chart and how that is different from the screen. The visualizer is the concrete resource version of that, isn't it?
It's conduit between our analog thinking and the digital.
Very nice. Okay, final question. What's a hill that you used to be willing to die on in education, but now find yourself perhaps walking back down?
That's a really, really good question. I think I was quite robotic in the way that I taught. And I think that my behaviour management was fairly good, that I could get the kids to behave and engage. And my teaching was fairly good. So the way that I would explain things and present things and the questions that I would ask would engage the children. But I don't think I thought nearly enough about what was going on in the children's heads. And, that's interesting that you've chosen to say or do that. I wonder why that is and what I could do to change the way we're feeling in this moment. And the school that I was at just yesterday, who were the fine Ofsted, the way that they work with children for whom school can be quite difficult is really beautiful and it's amazing. And their head teacher is completely inspirational. And she's got a phrase that's an interesting child. They just need someone to take an interest. And I wish I'd been told that earlier in my career. I think that would have changed the way that I'd.
That's a really good one. I was speaking with a fantastic former head teacher called John Thompson recently for episode 2 of this podcast, actually. And he's been thinking for a book, obviously, about what makes great teaching. And he worked with a lot of teachers and some other people and things to what differentiates that teacher that you remember from school from some of the other teachers that maybe don't stick in your head as readily. And his number one top tip for great teaching is enthusiasm. And I take that to mean not just standing at the front and smiling, but, taking a genuine interest and being actually interested and engaged and wanting to, curious about what's happening.
And I can remember.
And that to me is something you can't, you have to be it.
My CEO talking many years ago about having a class, and by kind of September you like most of them, and then by November you like nearly others, and then by Christmas you like them all. And I thought, I don't think I ever liked every child in my class, but kind of deliberately making the effort to like children and get to know children, I think it is, rather than liking them. You like all of them in their own little ways, but really understanding what makes them tick. One of my earlier teaching positions when I was down in London, there was one child who was really popular with the other kids, but I just could not see why he did nothing. He wasn't the most actively engaged in lessons, shall we say. And I didn't understand his popularity. And then at the end of the year, we went away on our residential, and I just got him straight away, because every time tensions were getting a bit high, there was any kind of dispute, he would just step in and chill things out with his just relaxed vibe. And he was brilliant. And if I'd known that at the beginning of the year, I'd realised that, I think the way that I interacted with him and the way that I taught him would have been completely...
I just think residentials are brilliant for that sort of thing. We used to do ours in the autumn term for exactly that reason.
Yeah.
So in the first school I worked at, it was in the summer term as a kind of carrot and stick for behaviour almost. You won't get to go on the residential if you... But when I moved schools, they happened to do them in the autumn term, and I just saw the benefit of that immediately, because some of those children who were passive or quiet in class, you saw them in a totally different light. And I will finish with this, actually, just what you said there. I did not prompt you for at all, but if there is one thread that has gone through all of the conversations that I've had so far that has come up every single time, it's the importance of those relationships in a classroom. And that's why I think it is difficult if you're going in and teaching, a one-off lesson. That can be quite hard if you don't have somebody who's already got those relationships, and not just because you know who to ask,
but
for
also
the answer.
You see children's faces light up sometimes because their experiences have been one thing, and maybe it's not quite right for them. I can remember a boy in a class that I taught this year in a year 6 lesson, and he had one-to-one support, and he was sat there with his one-to-one support, but he was accessing the maths lesson. And halfway through the lesson, he turned around to his one support and went, "I'm getting it. I'm getting maths." And it was that. It's kind of, you see, we can do it.
Why don't they all do that?
Well,
every child should do that. That would really have helped my self-esteem.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much, Tom.
Cheers, Tom.
I know this won't be the last time that we talk, but I would love to have you back again at some point in the future. It's been brilliant.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, mate.
Cheers, John. Take care. Bye-bye.